Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. Comic books and horror seem to have two things in common. People either love them or do not get down with them at all. And if you're in the latter camp, you may be thinking, a segment about a horror comic? Even if it is an Eisner Award nominee, is this really for me? As a self-admitted scaredy cat, I'm willing to wager it is. Because The Atonement Bell, which is set in St. Louis, written by a St. Louis author and illustrated by a St. Louis artist, captures so much of what makes STL the compelling and complicated place it is. Because The Atonement Bell, which is set in St. Louis, written by a St. Louis author and illustrated by a St. Louis artist, captures so much of what makes STL the compelling and complicated place it is. Here to talk with us about this comic series, whose 4 issues are now available together in one book, we have Jim Ousley, writer and co-creator of The Atonement Bell.
Thanks for having me.
And Tyler B. Ruff, artist and co-creator of The Atonement Bell. Welcome to you as well.
Hey, happy to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us today. So let's talk about the origins of the book, Jim. Where did the idea for this come from?
I've always been a big horror fan, horror movies and horror literature, and my favorite kind of horror is the kind that has a sort of social bent to it and has a bit of a heart. There's some hope in there somewhere, for the characters that are going through whatever they're going through. So the inspiration for it was actually the history of St. Louis and, friends I went to high school with and grew up with. And I noticed that the friends I grew up with, in neighborhoods and through high school, here in St. Louis, a lot of paths kind of diverged. And some of them had different theories on what religion could do and what religion should not be involved with. And I think those things got mixed up for a lot of people, and it kind of inspired the story.
Okay. And when was it that you started writing the story then?
I started writing this story a couple of years ago. It actually came from a screenplay that I had written previously, and the screenplay wasn't going anywhere. It was kind of a tone poem. It was just a real personal thing, and I wanted something that sort of communicated something more in an entertaining way. So I took a hard look at it and thought this would be a much better comic series. And so I rewrote everything and updated, and we have The Atonement Bell.
Right. Now, Tyler, you came after the idea of the story. It was written. How is it that you and Jim met?
So I write and illustrate a comic book series called The Unforgiven, and I've been working on that for about a decade now. And we had a signing at a free comic book day at All American Collectibles, and we got a signing there tomorrow. And we met there, and Jim needed an artist for the book after the first artist wasn't able to work with the project anymore. And I was into the story and thought I could do a good job with it, and I feel like I did.
Great. And then when you finally did read the story, as an artist, what was it that went through your mind as you were taking it in?
Well, it's a story that I feel like a lot of people can probably relate to these days, especially with how divided the country is. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of commentary on the nature of that in the book, and that spoke to me specifically. I think Jim and I are of similar ideologies. We're coming from a similar background in that sense. So it was a book that, after I had read the script, I felt compelled to work on and felt that I could do it justice.
Yeah. And were you seeing things as you were reading?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And that's how I kind of I storyboard every page and lay it out panel for panel, before I ever get started with the actual artwork, penciling and inking and everything beyond it. So, I'm kind of picturing it in my head as I'm laying it out on the page and as I'm reading it.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the story. Jim, in the foreword of the book, you say that the characters in The Atonement Bell came as you mentioned, from an earlier work, which was the Angels of Warwick. And you've carried these characters around with you, as well as this story. And then you'd said something about sort of walking around with them. Mm-hmm. Where were you walking when these characters were in your midst?
I think when you're working on a series or any piece, you kind of fall in love with the characters after a while. And in a funny way, they really do. As strange as it sounds, they become your friends, you know. So when I say they walk around with me, you know, they walk around wherever I go. I go on walks every day, and so when I would do that, I would sort of have conversations with them in my mind, hear them talk to each other. I mean, that's essentially what writing is. Once you have characters you love, you listen to them. Mm-hmm. What are they telling you?
Right. They take on their own life.
Absolutely.
Now, these characters, there are a number of them, and the whole thing with horror stories, as I had said in the introduction, I am not someone who looks for that. In fact, I often will avoid it. But as I was reading, I was like, wait a minute, this is not what I thought it was going to be. Mm-hmm. And it was very much about this story. So it's a family that is dealing with tragic loss. Mm-hmm. A teenaged boy, Jake, and his mom, Kayla, visiting Aunt Tiana during Christmas time, and they've been estranged for a little bit. And then weird things start happening to Jake. Some of it is physical, other is visual. Most of it is unexplained. Then we meet Jake's cousin, baby Al, who is not much of a baby in a lot of ways. He's the favorite cousin, some comic relief. And Al's friend, who's a seer of sorts, and she's a Bosnian-American girl.
Correct.
And then we start looking into the history of Aunt Tiana's church, and you mentioned earlier about people who have different points of view about what should and shouldn't be, and right. Faith kind of being part of that. And then the uncovering of a centuries-old curse that requires human sacrifice. There's the horror part. And that's just scratching the surface. So as you were seeing these characters, and for each of you, you spent a lot of time in St. Louis, and you grew up here, mm-hmm. Jim. These characters are all Black.
Right.
And I'm sitting here, and nobody can see, but you are two white men.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, what was the motivation for you behind having the characters be Black and their Black American culture being very much a part of the storytelling?
There's actually two levels to that. So when I first thought of the characters, in my mind, when I saw them, they were Black. That was sort of something that was inextricable for me. You know, that's just how I saw them. Secondly, growing up, there was a strong division between white and Black. In fact, the neighborhood that I grew up in, which was Ferguson, actually Calvin Park, which was right outside of Ferguson, mm-hmm. There was actually a fence at the end of our neighborhood that went into Hazelwood, which was predominantly Black. But there was a fence dividing the two. And there would be some fights every once in a while. And growing up, I could never understand it whatsoever. There's actually a great book called The Broken Heart of St. Louis by Walter Johnson, I believe, that goes into detail about St. Louis's roots with race relations and racist capitalism and all that kind of, and how that shaped our city. Mm-hmm. And I just find that fascinating, you know. So it was important for me for the characters to be African American.
Yeah.
And secondly, to have a Bosnian character, because Bosnians, you know, rejuvenated a big part of St. Louis
right.
When they immigrated here. So I just find those different things fascinating, because in media, St. Louis doesn't get a good showing a lot of the times. You know, mm-hmm. I always think about not Christmas Vacation, but the first Vacation movie where the car breaks down and all the wheels get stolen. You know, that's kind of typical of like
right,
what happens.
Right.
Yeah.
The National Lampoon's
Vacation.
Okay.
Yeah. But and there's a ton of examples like that. But St. Louis is actually a beautiful city, mm-hmm. very ethnically diverse, and it's worthy of celebrating. I think that you can celebrate it while recognizing and discussing its troubled history, though, and its ramifications.
Mm-hmm. Now, Tyler, you took the story that Jim wrote, you put amazing imagery to it, and you wrote the books afterward, and you'd mentioned there that the art all came together while you continued work on your own comic book series, The Unforgiven, which you mentioned 2011, I think is when you started it. And you were also putting in work hours doing oncology research.
Yeah,
no big deal.
It was a lot all at once.
Yeah. So, I mean, even with all of that going on, there is an incredible degree of detail in the scenes. And many of the locations in the book are very St. Louis. And I've said many times, I'm a transplant and I've lived all over the place and also done my best to kind of go to different parts of the city. But there were some parts that I thought like I recognized. Old North?
Yeah.
St. Louis. Okay, so I'm right about that.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Oh, sweet.
there are all the locations in the book. I went and scouted and took reference photos and wanted to just be in the places and made sure I rendered them faithfully and authentically. I didn't want someone reading the book, especially from here where I figured probably it would have the biggest audience, to be like, well, that street doesn't connect to that street. I live there. I know, because I would be the person who would do that, like reading, anytime I see depictions of St. Louis, like we were talking about in other media, like Up in the Air, the George Clooney film was filmed here, and part of it. And then they go to Wisconsin at some point, but it's still St. Louis. and I'm like, I recognize that. That's still St. Louis. You can't fool me. But so I didn't want that to be the experience. I wanted people who lived here to be able to know that that's their city exactly.
Yeah. So. Were there any illustrations that Tyler did that struck you as, oh my gosh, that's what I was thinking about as I was writing, and he just managed to capture it?
I think, quite honestly, I think it's the whole thing. The great benefit of Tyler being a co-creator on this and doing all the artwork is that he has an incredible eye for detail. I think this is some of his best work. And secondly, because so much of it is characters talking to each other, his facial acting for these characters is remarkable. And I didn't have really any notes, hardly at all for you, did I?
Yeah, it was a pretty easygoing process in that respect. Yeah, absolutely. I have a drama background, so I've spent a lot of time, emoting and trying to understand emoting for to communicate exactly what is supposed to be, the emotion's supposed to be displayed on the person's face when you're up on the stage, and I think that comes through. I think in a lot of the facial expressions that I wanted to make sure there was unequivocally like, oh, this person is experiencing this.
Right.
And, that's what you need for readers to be able to relate. Mm-hmm. So.
And one of the things that our producer, Maya Norfleet, noticed was Aunt Tiana and her facial expressions, sort of the side eye.
Yeah.
So were there facial sort of models that you had as you were trying to put together the human, and let's be really specific about that, the human characters in the Atonement Bell?
Yeah, I'll pull up Photo Booth on my MacBook and I'll do all the facial expressions myself.
Oh,
I'll act it out, and I'll have I've got, to my girlfriend's credit, a lot of the more difficult angles or something. It's like, okay, now I need you to look like you're stabbed here or whatever, and she'll go along with it and give me the reference photos I need, and for other more difficult things that I can't necessarily do myself.
Yeah. So. It's like relationship goals there.
Yeah. Like, bless her.
So what were some of your favorite scenes to draw that most St. Louisans would probably notice and recognize?
Definitely that the page in the Central Library, or the few scenes in the Central Library. I took quite a few photos in there to make sure I had any kind of backdrop I'd want to have for all the scenes that took place in there, and that was the one page that I'm thinking of in particular. I think anybody who's read the book would probably know exactly which one I mean. In the second issue, where you can see the main big room there. That page itself probably took me like 25 hours altogether to pencil and ink.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful page.
Yeah,
and it helped me understand why most comic artists probably don't put this level of detail in their comic pages. It's a medium that kind of demands brevity, but I've never really been able to do that.
Okay.
I have to put it all in, and I enjoy putting it all in. It just takes a long time.
Yeah. Is there a scene or an illustration, something that was inspired by a thing that is meaningful to you that others might not notice?
There are a lot of little Easter eggs like from St. Louis in there.
Okay.
Like one character is drinking out of a Protzel's Deli mug in one scene, and I mean, I love Protzel's Deli. They've got fantastic food. So, the food in St. Louis is really important.
It is, absolutely. We talk about food here all the time.
It's not the easiest thing to fit into the story or render or anything like that, but I threw in some things like that in places that things that are just I've always loved about the city that are important to me. So
there's a church.
Yeah.
Tell us about the church.
So that church, that's the one departure I had from the city proper itself. That's St. Peter and Paul Catholic Church. That's just a few blocks from my house. So I knew I was going to have to draw the church in there a lot, and I currently live in Waterloo across the river. So I'm like, well, I'm not going to be able to go and keep going back and forth all the time to take all these different angles I'm going to need. So I'm going to use that church because it's the kind of old German church, Jim, you wanted in there. And I'm like, it's the perfect style. I'll just change the street. Yeah. I'll just put the church on a St. Louis street and use the church for the architecture.
But there's an interesting way, though, that some of those things that are immediately recognizable as that thing exists, right? But then also ones that it could be somewhere here, like Forest Park. That was kind of tripping me out a little bit because, Forest Park is huge, and I know that I have not visited every corner of it, but to think that maybe there's something there that I didn't know about or that other people don't know about.
It's unsettling, right?
Like a coven.
Yeah.
Sure. We heard a promo earlier about witches. It's like the timing is perfect there. Yeah. To go back to this thing about horror and general audiences' sort of relationship with that there can be some aversion to the idea of reading or taking in something that is scary or frightening. And I may be projecting, but when I heard about this book, that's the form in which I read it all together, the issues, I automatically was thinking, I need to read this when it's sunny outside. Because I've had the experience of reading, for example, oh my goodness, it was a graphic novel about Jack the Ripper by Alan Moore.
Was it From Hell?
From Hell,
yeah.
that's it. I could not read that before I went to bed. It really, and that's black and white, it haunted my dreams. So when I'm talking with people about this book who have some of the same apprehensions that I might have, what should I explain to them about the story, Jim?
About our story in particular?
Yeah.
Well, I think it just in general with horror, I think what horror does, it tends to push your buttons a little bit. And by doing that, it makes you vulnerable. And when it makes you vulnerable, you're open up to all kinds of emotions. And I think that's why a lot of horror, when it's done right, can be successful and be impactful, I think the one thing with this book, with this series, what was important to me, aside from the social stuff, which is all there and intentional, it should also be fun, but I think it also has to have hope. And there has to be some kind of display of empathy there, because you can't just go through horrible things and learn nothing. They can't just happen because, they're cool or they're bloody or they're gross or whatever. There's got to be a journey and a destination in mind, So, a lot of the through line for a lot of work that I do is family, and how family members relate to each other and how far you would go to protect family, and what it really means. And it's not just blood family. Yeah. It's people you collect along in your life, So to me, the book is a lot about that.
And it's also how far you will go to jack up your own family.
Right.
Which was a very interesting thing, to see develop in the story. How about for you? Is horror something that you like to illustrate, or was this just the meeting of two people of the same sensibilities, and that's really what drove this? Yeah,
no, illustrating horror is not something I'm typically, because mine's a sci-fi action adventure series, what I primarily do, but I think all good sci-fi, like all good horror, is never really about the thing that it's looking like it's about on the surface. Like, it's not really about zombies. Yeah. Zombies aren't really the monster. It's the people and how they react to it, and what they do in the face of a disintegrating society. That's the real like horror of the book, and of any good story like that. Twilight Zone, those aren't really about what they are on the surface, the monsters of the week or whatever. It's actually about the monsters inside all of us,
Yes.
And I think that's what draws me to it and makes it fun.
Tyler B. Ruff is the artist and co-creator of The Atonement Bell, and Jim Ousley is writer and co-creator of The Atonement Bell. This is a comic book series that is now available as a book. I picked up my copy from the Wizard's Wagon, and I think it's available pretty much anywhere you find your favorite comics. Thank you so much, Tyler and Jim, for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
This episode was produced by Maya Norfleet.
Our audio engineer is Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com